it's 10 o'clock, I will help us get started on time because I know you have a really great presentation and I don't want people to miss any of it. So as folks are coming into the room, I want to welcome everyone here. I'm Karen Warner and I'm your host here, so I'll be watching the chat. So if you have questions, and I'd like to introduce to you, we have Aaron Jacks with us today and Shelley Brooks. I'm going to introduce themselves as they step into their slide deck. You'll notice they've already shared it, and you can double click on it to make it come up in a more maximized view if you're having trouble seeing it on the screen. And if you're the type of person who likes to follow along, you'll see in the chat there is the link to their slide deck, so you can choose the way you want to learn during this session. So Aaron and Shelley, thank you so much for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So hi, my name is Erin Jackson. I'm an Education Programs Assistant in the Curriculum Frameworks and Instructional Resources Division at the California Department of Education. I know it's kind of a mouthful. So before I worked at the CDE, I was in middle school and then a high school history, social science, and English teacher. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to Shelley.
Great. Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Karen. I work for the California History Social Science Project, where I develop classroom resources and provide professional learning for history social science teachers. And I'm part of the California Environmental Literacy Initiative for K-12 schools. I'm a trained environmental historian, so I also lecture at UC Davis in US and environmental history courses. And I'm excited for this overlap of topics and opportunities to meet with teachers in the STEAM disciplines.
So there's a question at the bottom of the screen. So if you could introduce yourself in the chat and let us know what grade levels and subjects you teach, that would be great. So I'm going to start by going over our objectives really quickly. So our objective today is twofold. So first, we want to set the stage by identifying some of the existing similarities between history, social science, and STEAM. Second, we want to look at how students can delve into complex social issues by using the tools, skills, and content knowledge that these two disciplinary fields offer. We will also have some resources to help you develop your own lessons and units. And if we have any extra time at the end of our session, we would like to give you all an opportunity to start thinking about how today's presentation might apply to your teaching. Okay, so go ahead and take a minute to look through these lists. And so to clarify, these lists are not exhaustive. So I'll give you a second to read. So both STEAM and history social science are inquiry driven. So they both focus on many of the same skill sets. They're also both interdisciplinary. So we use the term history social science to highlight that what we have traditionally referred to as history can also include geography, political science, ethnic studies, sociology, psychology, anthropology, and a number of other disciplines. So there's also some content overlap. For example, recently there has been a really big push to incorporate environmental issues and environmental literacy into history social science. So today we're going to see how some of these things in these lists can be applied to a lesson activity. Okay, so the big question that we're looking at today is how can we deepen student learning by combining STEAM practices and history social science? So I'm going to give you a second to read through these cross-cutting concepts, which are taken from the Next Generation Science Standards. Okay, so these cross-cutting concepts demonstrate that science alone cannot be used to develop solutions to complex social problems. So this is where history social science can come in and provide the critical historical, social, and cultural context, as well as a forum for discussing ethics, values, and policy. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see there's a question that we would like you to answer in the chat. So we want you to really think about what are some of the relationships between what you teach, your discipline, and history social science. Okay, and I'll hand it over to Shelley.
Great. Thank you, Erin. And if you could advance to the next slide, please. we will take a look at, all right, so we're looking at a big question here, and thinking that as students go back to school this fall, many of which, probably most of which, will be doing this online, we wanted to think about what are some ways that we can engage students, keep them interested in the learning, and help them feel the relevance of what they are learning through digital platforms. And so we thought about the importance of connecting to current events. Obviously, the pandemic is on all of our minds. I think the movement for Black Lives is also on most people's minds. And so thinking about how can we help students fully understand these events, and the value of using both STEAM and history social science-based investigations to uncover the depth of the information that we hope students can gather from the world, about the world around them. And thinking about such questions as, what is the science behind the higher COVID-19 fatality rate among people of color? What's the data that helps us understand this different fatality rate? And what are the historic and current social realities that contribute to people of color's higher fatality rates from COVID? And you see, we've also used this bigger question that you see on the slide here, ways of perhaps framing an investigation around this current situation, current events that are permeating the news. And if you could please advance to the next slide. There we go. And what you can see, and if you add in the next part too, thank you, Erin, you can see that these headlines and this data about COVID deaths in Los Angeles County, and oops, we went a little far there. If we go back, we'll see that, thank you, these are early dates, right? This was as of April 26th, and I was trying to find a data set, and obviously these numbers are no longer accurate, but a representation here. And what we know by looking at these headlines, looking at this data, is that race and class are strong predictors of susceptibility to COVID. And in keeping with the racial reckoning that our country is experiencing right now, we can ask students to dig deeper, to look at the studies that reveal some of the health-related dangers of being Black in America. We looked at a study from 2017 from the NAACP and the Clean Air Task Force, which reveals that African Americans are 75% more likely than other Americans to live near facilities that produce hazardous waste. So that helps us kind of build a piece of evidence here for understanding these disparities in health outcomes. And also an EPA report found that Black Americans are subjected to higher levels of air pollution than white Americans, and that's actually regardless of income level. And we know that air pollution contributes to lung disease, including asthma, as well as heart disease and diabetes. And we know that these health conditions make a person much more likely to develop serious complications or die from a COVID-19 infection. So this is part of the information that we are thinking about. How can we blend the skills and the evidence that we see in these different disciplines in order to help students get at the heart of this major issue right now in our country. And if you could advance, please, Erin, to the next slide. You can see this quote here at the top. And I'm including this because in order to help students understand another layer of the social protests that we're witnessing in the country, it helps to have students consider the fact that these injustices have long been recognized by the government and have yet to be resolved. This is a quote from the civil rights leader James Farmer, who served as Assistant Secretary of Health in 1970. And he spoke outside his government office on the nation's first Earth Day, outlining the connections between race and public health. And what Farmer identified can also be called environmental racism, which is linked to the legacy and the history of residential segregation. We know that the segregation was exacerbated by redlining practices in the 20th century, that made it difficult for African Americans and other people of color to obtain housing mortgages. We know that redlining helped prompt a general disinvestment in communities of color, with the result being more dilapidated or crowded or poorly ventilated housing in often environmentally unhealthy locations. And these communities are often near industrial plants that emit various pollutants, also near freeways that have a similar effect. And while the EPA now includes an office that's focused on environmental justice, this has been far from enough to solve the problems of environmental racism. And these maps that you see here at the bottom of Fresno relate again to the current situation. And we see on the left that the highest COVID cases are concentrated around Highway 99, which on the right side, you can see a little more clearly that the black line that designates 99, that intersects the Fresno area. And the hardest hit areas by COVID on the left map that you see in red and orange largely overlap with the areas of greatest poverty that we see in red and orange on the map on the right in Fresno. And so unraveling the relationship between race and poverty and pollution, and not just for African Americans, but for Latinos, indigenous peoples, other minorities, we know that this is complex, and it requires that we look through the lenses of the hard and the social sciences. And so we wanted to share some tools, if you don't already know about these or use them, that you might find them quite useful. And if you could please advance, Erin, to the next slide. I wanted to share the CalEnviro screen, a tool that might help students do this unraveling we're talking about, and tools that also can be used, of course, with online learning. And we see here a screenshot of a map of Los Angeles County that the Enviro screen captured. And the CalEnviro screen tracks pollution burdens by census tract. You can go down to the level of a census tract, but also up much broader, like you can see here, to a whole county. And we know that there are questions that we can ask about these situations that we're seeing, where we see in the dark red area higher burdens of asthma, low birth weight, challenges with access to quality education, that poverty is high as well. And so one of the things that we could ask is, what government choices and policies or social practices helped create these conditions? And if we blend together these sort of investigative questions with this sort of science data, gathering the numbers and using the technology that helps us understand the science behind these realities, we know that we can add nuance and depth to student learning, or we hope we can at least. And so wanted to show one last tool on the next page next slide please, there we go, that's the question about the inquiry question we can consider. And just a reminder that these tools that we're sharing, you'll find the links in the presentation so you can visit them yourself. And on the next slide, we'll see the Regional Opportunity Index, which is something that the Center for Regional Change at UC Davis has provided for investigation. And you can see it uses similar sort of mapping tools here. And this provides even more data to use. For instance, we see 3 screenshots here of the same area in Southern California, but what we're looking at are the health and environmental opportunities on the left, which encompasses such things as infant health, births by teenagers, as well as years of life lost to environmental factors or other social factors, so lower average lifespan than the national lifespan. We also see in the second column economic opportunity. It shows employment rate, minimum basic income, educational opportunity. It includes such things as college education levels, English proficiency, math proficiency, truancy rates at school. And the Regional Opportunity Index also offers data on housing, on transportation, on civic life, and other sorts of data that help really get into the aspects of what makes a community tick, right? And so hopefully you, if you haven't already used these, can see the value, or if you have used them, we'd be very glad to hear about the value that you find in having students investigate their own particular communities, or perhaps choosing other communities in the state as a point of comparison, or to contrast with their own place, their own hometown. And what are some of the questions that we can ask around it? And so I'll hand this back to Erin, who will help explore some ideas for other ways to go with these blendings of history, social science, investigative questions with the tools and the types of practices used in the STEAM discipline.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. So let's quickly revisit these cross-cutting concepts. So we saw how data can be used to help identify some of the consequences of systemic racism, but that data alone does not offer any solutions or identify the policies that resulted in these outcomes. And that's where history social science can come in and fill in those gaps. So like Shelley mentioned, redlining, housing and development policies, and community investment are all some of the historical elements that helped create this situation. So it's not enough to just look at the data and what we see today. It's also important to look back at the historical context and figure out how we got to where we are. So this next slide here. So one of the big pieces that we wanted to emphasize in this presentation is how we cannot just dump a bunch of information on students and show them what is a pretty horrific reality, but also empower them to come up with solutions and address this problem. So environmental justice and the impacts of systemic racism on health in our communities is not a new or a novel issue. We've had access to this data for decades. But again, that data alone doesn't give us solutions. So what's missing is how we can use that data to inform social, political, and economic change. And then in the classroom, we need to find a way to empower students to imagine and design some solutions. So here we have a list of some possible projects and activities that would allow students to take that next step. So you'll notice that each task here begins with assessing a situation, which would include the gathering of the data, the gathering of information, and then it ends with imagining, designing, or proposing some kind of solution. So the question at the bottom, which we would like you to ask or at least start thinking about, is what are some other engineering, art, or other technology-based classroom activities or projects that could be added to this list? So in thinking about not just what do we want students to learn, but what do we want them to be able to do with that knowledge? Okay, and then in this slide here, so we have a link to a Google Doc that has some resources, and that resource doc includes content standards and some resources, as well as standards that we sort of use to inspire today's lesson, and then a lesson template. And I know that, I always hated having to use lesson templates because I like to do lessons my own way. But in creating that lesson template, we wanted to at least generate some questions that would help you come up with ideas for how to take all of this information and try to create your own lesson. And then the link to the slides.
Erin, if I could just interject, I see that Joshua was thinking about tracking the COVID-19 cases in the county there for a week. So taking it really local and then checking what percent that is part of the population of the county that's becoming infected. So he's looking at a real local issue.
Yeah, some of these comments in the chat are great. It's hard not being able to respond to all of you and actually have a discussion. But this is, yeah, I'm really enjoying reading through this chat.
Yeah. And I see that Shelley did just put in the link to the links in the chat. So if that is more helpful, so you don't have to type out everything that you see here.
Right, and I'll also add the slide link. And Erin, do you think it's, we have a little bit of time, would you be able to share the Google Doc link, or show the page of that Google Doc, and we can talk about some of the resources that are available there?
Yeah.
Sure.
And please note that I believe you all have the ability to come on and speak. Is that true, Karen, with this many people? And okay, you're muted right now, Karen, but I think that you're saying yes. And so, all right. And so I was going to just say, please, are there ways that you have already been doing this toward the end of last year? I'm curious if you had started to engage with COVID in your classroom, if you'd wanted to share that, or any plans that you're making for how to do so this fall. You can chat, put it in the chat box, or just speak if that's easier.
Right, they have a little button up in their corner, and I can add them, and Joshua has now requested it, so we'll welcome Joshua on.
Hi, I like being on camera. No, so I was long-term subbing last semester for a class when COVID started to become a thing. And so I already had my students coming in and using hand sanitizer immediately when coming to the room, even though they were like, it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal. Just like, just do it, please, just go with it. For myself, I've designed a bunch of different projects I want for my students, but most of them were interactive. And one of them, and I was discussing this with during a networking, was to paint a house. So they would have to go measure a house, find the area, find a paint, purchase it. And so I've altered that to where I give them the measurements of the house, but they still have to find the area, find out how much paint cost, and do all that. So I think with a lot of the interactive things, doing a slight adjustment for me was something that I was able to do with that project. Other projects I looked at that I had designed, sure, there's no way to get them to be able to do virtually because it's like 3-man, 4-man projects. So that's one thing that I've started adjusting over the summer, especially when I was looking for a position, was how can I do this if we have to do virtually? What tasks can I give my students? So that's one thing that I worked on. And one of my plans, and this is something I'll even do when we're in the classroom, is to video my lessons, short lessons, and then have my class time where they can ask questions about the lesson. And then when we actually go back to physical, if we're able to, is still have them watch the videos at home for their homework time, then come in, work on it, and ask questions there. So I don't have to do a whole lesson and try to help them with the homework. They've already seen the lesson and they can come in and do the homework in class where I can help them. So that's one thing that I've thought about and thought, well, if I adjust it all the way, then I can just do that permanently. And then I'll have my videos and never have to record them, except make adjustments. So that's something that I've been doing to prepare for the upcoming school year.
Great, thank you. So, I mean, does anybody have any questions or ideas?
Responses to Josh? Yeah. Thinking
I
about.
noticed, as we're watching the chat, going back to what Joshua was saying about ideas for if there's a project that you're wanting to do and you need to have the students work in smaller groups. I'm just wondering if we could use the brain power of everyone that's in this breakout room. Like, what are some ways, we could give opportunities to do this where we have like 20 some people in this session, but how could we think about having some smaller breakout, giving students smaller groups to work with? And so Joshua was saying that he is thinking of ways for students to choose to work along in maybe groups of 4. I know that, or, you know, he said, to work alone, or they can work in groups of 4. I do know that when it's a smaller group, you feel more pressure to speak. And so sometimes students can kind of sit back a little bit. So if they did work either alone or in smaller groups, it might be a way to get them to feel more engaged.
I know there are many elementary teachers here today, and wondering ways that you have been thinking about, will you be doing anything differently online in terms of blending different subjects together, and what that might look like, and seeing, you know, opportunities to maybe, if you're teaching English language arts, using historical text, or ways of doing math with some social problem, or something that students are aware of in their community, and so forth. So I'm curious what this looks like. I was talking to an elementary school teacher last night in my neighborhood, and she was saying that her district is largely just focusing on math and English language arts, at least at the beginning of the year. And so she says, but as a history major, I don't want to lose that. So I'm trying to think of ways to weave in opportunities. And so.
Yeah, and actually, I know, yeah, there are a lot of elementary teachers on here. And as I was looking through the History Social Science framework, there are a lot of really great essential questions outlined in the framework that are about community and how communities are built and established. And so kind of like with this lesson, I know this is more of a, you know, middle school, probably more high school level activity, but there are a lot of opportunities in elementary school, in the elementary sort of sections of the framework, to talk about community and to talk about, you know, design a community, and, you know, sort of a look in your own community and assess what's there and how it's structured. And so that would allow you to tie in both the sort of contemporary issues as well as tying in math and science, and looking at, well, how would you, you know, construct a community? How would you construct a community garden or a playground or a new school? And so if you're thinking about ways to try and tie all of this together, obviously I'm biased because I'm a huge history person, but I strongly recommend looking at some of those essential questions that are outlined in the framework as a good starting point.
So we have about 1.5 minutes before we will go into our break. So if there are more questions, and you're welcome to request to come online. As you were talking, Erin, I was thinking about a session that I went to the other day. They were talking about weaving in with the history and the math, also weaving in the art, and that a lot of times art is a place to start with getting, when you're starting to build those relationships and setting your routines those first days of school, that art sometimes can be a way to get students engaged and feeling like they can express themselves. So when you're talking about like build, you know, how would you want a playground, like to be able to draw it or somehow build something that would be, you know, some playground equipment that they might want to see in their real playground. It might be a place to start, along with what I think Joshua had mentioned, which is giving them choice. So maybe it's everybody build something for the playground, or everybody, you know, it could be a collective project, but each have its piece.
Yeah, when I see Shelley Springer just mentioned labor laws and evaluating them mathematically, and that's a great topic to look at. And there's a lot of really interesting data that you can look at, and some great, you know, photography. So I think that's a really cool lesson idea. I like that. It makes me miss being in the classroom.
Erin and Shelley, I want to thank you both for taking the time to come share your energy and your expertise with us. And I want to thank everyone who came into the breakout room to for being here. We now have a 15-minute break, and then we're going to be going on to some other breakout sessions starting at 10:45. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
all, and have a great start to the year.
Yes, good luck, everyone.
And this session was recorded so others can view it later. So you may get some questions later about some of your resources. So this is just the beginning. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.